My hand still smelled faintly of coffee as I answered the call that would unspool my quiet life. My daughter's voice was clipped and icy as she said, "Mom, you won $12.6 million. And then she paused so long I could hear my own heartbeat. Her next words felt like being pushed down a well. "If you ever want to see Thomas again, you'll give us half." I gripped the receiver as if it could anchor me to the linoleum floor, while the walls of my kitchen seemed to lean in. Thomas's framed first-grade photo hung above the stove, his gap-toothed smile oblivious to how his parents were wielding him. At 72, I thought I had weathered enough storms, but this ultimatum cracked something deep inside. The smell of last night's meatloaf reheating in the microwave suddenly turned metallic in my mouth. My house in Dayton, Ohio felt both too small and too full of the echo of my daughter's threat. I had not breathed a word about the lottery to Alice or Steve, yet somehow they knew, and that frightened me more than the money. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to subscribe so that you're the first to listen to these new stories as I post them here on the channel, and click the like button to show other moms with grown-up kids that we're all in this together. The clock above the sink ticked relentlessly toward the next minute, a small kindness in a moment that felt untethered from time. "How do you know?" I whispered, part of me still hoping this was a cruel joke that would dissolve into laughter. There was a rustle, then Steve's voice came on the line, oily and insistent, explaining how they had seen the news about the winning ticket purchased at the Kroger on 5th Street. He said they had already done the math, splitting $12.6 million after taxes, and that half would set them up for life without me getting in the way. Alice cut in to say they deserved it because I owed them for all those years of raising Thomas without any help. My mouth went dry as I realized they viewed my love and babysitting as a debt they were collecting with interest. The betrayal wasn't only about the money, it was about how quickly they were willing to ransom my only grandchild. The coffee pot beeped, breaking the silence, and I hung up without saying goodbye, my fingers numb. My heart pounded like it did the night my late husband Carl and I rushed to the hospital in a blizzard 40 years ago. Back then, we were young and poor and grateful for every warm coat donated by the church, and our daughter was just a colicky baby who couldn't sleep. Now that baby was demanding I hand over half of a fortune I had stumbled into out of sheer luck. In that moment, I promised myself I would never be bullied into buying my own child's affection, even if it meant losing the little boy who called me Grandma. I stared at the ticket again, its numbers embossed like a secret code, and wondered if it would end up costing me everything that mattered. When the call ended, the house felt cavernous, as if every memory stacked in the photo albums on my shelf was shivering with me. The next morning, I drove my old Ford Taurus to the Ohio Lottery Commission office, the ticket sealed in a plastic bag tucked inside my worn purse. The roads were slick with spring rain, and every red light gave me too much time to replay Alice's ultimatum. "There's no rush to claim it," the letter had said, but I wanted to get the facts before gossip could twist them further. At the counter, a woman with a State of Ohio badge examined my ticket, her expression gentle as she confirmed that it was indeed worth $12.6 million. She explained the lump sum versus annuity options using a laminated chart with percentages and tax brackets that made my head spin. "You'll want to speak to a financial advisor," she said, handing me a packet thicker than a phone book. My palms were sweating as I signed forms acknowledging the withholding rules and the mandatory federal and state taxes. It hit me that even if I gave Alice half, it wouldn't be the tidy $6.3 million they imagined after the IRS took its share. There was a cooling off period before the funds were released, she said, and she recommended I deposit the check at a bank and not carry cash. On my drive home, the dashboard clock flashed 11:11, an accidental prayer that things might somehow make sense. The plan formed slowly, like dough rising under a damp tea towel in my mother's kitchen decades ago. I would not tell Alice about the money until I had protections in place, and even then only on my terms. First, I needed to understand the law about recording phone conversations in Ohio, because my son-in-law's threats might be illegal. Ohio is a one-party consent state, my attorney cousin Marilyn later confirmed, meaning I could record calls as long as I was part of them. I made a mental note, but decided to use that tool only if absolutely necessary. I wasn't going to turn my kitchen into a sting operation. Instead, I scheduled an appointment with a lawyer at a local firm recommended by my retired teacher friend, Denise. Denise came over that afternoon, bringing a thermos of Folgers and her calm presence, and she listened as I told her what happened. We sat at my kitchen table, the same oak table Carl had sanded and varnished 30 years ago, while the rain tapped on the windows. Remember when Grace's stories covered a woman whose children tried to force her into selling her house? Denise asked quietly. I nodded. I had watched that video last week, hearing another grandmother's heartbreak and her quiet retaliation, and I realized I wasn't alone. Her story had ended with her putting her home into a trust and leaving everything to her grandchildren, skipping the adult children who had bullied her. It sounded radical then, but now, facing Alice's manipulation, it felt like the only sane path. Denise squeezed my hand and reminded me that my love for Thomas didn't have to come with enabling his parents' entitlement. She also mentioned that she had a good relationship with a banker at the local U.S. bank branch who could explain deposit holds and interest rates. That evening I went through my files, pulling out my birth certificate, Carl's death certificate, the deed to my home, and an old letter from my own mother. The letter smelled faintly of lavender and reminded me of a time when mothers and daughters trusted each other with secrets instead of threats. I slept fitfully, the lottery ticket sealed in a mason jar in the freezer, a silly trick I'd heard on the radio for safekeeping, but it gave me comfort. By morning I had a list: find a financial advisor, meet the attorney, open a new account, and set boundaries with Alice and Steve. When I pulled into the U.S. Bank parking lot later that week, my stomach fluttered like I was on a first date instead of approaching a teller. The lobby smelled of polished wood and hand sanitizer, and a young man in a navy blazer greeted me and asked how he could help. I won the lottery, I said quietly, feeling both foolish and proud, and he ushered me into an office with a fake ficus in the corner. He explained that large deposits over $10,000 require a hold and trigger federal forms, but that the bank could help with the transfer once the check arrived. He also warned that anyone I added to the account could withdraw money without my consent, so I should keep it in my name only or in a trust. He offered me a bottle of water and asked if I had a financial planner, and I told him I was meeting with an attorney the next day to discuss that. Walking out of the bank, I felt a little less naive and a little more determined not to be railroaded by my own family. At my attorney's office, which was above a State Farm insurance branch and smelled faintly of copier toner, I met Ms. Renee Parker. She was in her 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake, and she had the calm of someone who had seen families tear each other apart over far less. I told her everything, the call, the threat, my plans to protect Thomas, and my fear of being cut out of his life. She took notes and then looked me in the eye and said, "Mabel, you don't owe your daughter anything but honesty and boundaries." She explained that I could set up a revocable living trust for the bulk of the funds, designating Thomas as the primary beneficiary when he turns 25. I could also create a smaller trust to cover my living expenses and charitable donations, ensuring no one could coerce me into handing over cash. "You have every right to control your assets," she said, "and if they threaten you or Thomas, we can file for a restraining order." I exhaled, realizing that the law could be a shield rather than a weapon aimed at me. Renee also pointed out that Ohio courts prefer familial visitation agreements that are written, so if Alice tried to withhold Thomas without cause, I could petition for grandparent visitation. The idea of dragging my family into court made my stomach twist, but the thought of never again hearing Thomas giggle was worse. I left the office with a folder of documents to sign and a new sense of agency, but also a heavy grief for the family I thought I had. At home, I made a pot of Campbell's chicken noodle soup and stared at the steam swirling, thinking about how trust and soup both start clear and can turn cloudy fast. I wondered when exactly Alice had stopped seeing me as her mother and started seeing me as a bank. Maybe it was when Steve lost his job at the manufacturing plant and their mortgage balloon payment loomed. Maybe it was when I had co-signed for their first minivan and bailed them out with a check from my savings when Steve's truck engine died in the middle of an icy night. Or maybe it was in those quiet resentments layered over years of small slights, like them forgetting my birthday while I still sent care packages with Thomas's favorite cereal. On Friday, I visited Thomas at his elementary school, where I volunteered to read once a week, my hands smelling of Crayola markers and cafeteria pizza. He hugged me around the waist, his small body fitting perfectly against mine, and whispered, "Mommy says we're going to be rich." I smiled tightly and asked what he thought of that, and he said he didn't know, but that he hoped we could all go to Disney World like his friend Miguel. I swallowed the urge to cry and told him that as long as Grandma was around, he'd always have someone to make him pancakes. I left him with his class and walked past a bulletin board covered in Mother's Day projects, each card a messy expression of love and gratitude. I caught a glimpse of a card Thomas had written to me last year, still tucked in my purse, the crayon lines wobbly but sincere. Back home, I flipped through our photo albums, pausing at a picture of Alice at her wedding 12 years ago, radiant in a simple lace dress. Steve had squeezed my hand that day and promised to take care of her, and I had believed him because I wanted to. Now, the memory of that promise felt like sandpaper against my heart. That weekend, I set up a small audio recorder, legal under Ohio's one-party consent law, by the phone in case Steve or Alice called again. I hoped I wouldn't need it, but I wanted evidence if they threatened me further. I also changed the locks on my front door, a simple quick set I bought at Lowe's, because the spare key I had given Alice years ago suddenly felt like a liability. As I installed the new deadbolt, the metallic click gave me a sense of control I hadn't felt in days. The hardware associate at Lowe's had recommended a model that could be rekeyed easily, which suited me. I could control access without replacing the entire fixture. When Alice called again, her tone was rehearsed cheerfulness, asking if I was free for lunch at Applebee's. We met the next day, and she ordered a Diet Coke while I stuck with water, trying to keep my hands from shaking on the laminated menu. There was a hint of perfume that was not her usual vanilla, and I wondered if she had borrowed some from a friend to appear more polished. "Look, Mom," she said, stirring her straw, "this is bigger than any of us, and Steve has done the math and taxes and all that." She slid a crumpled printout across the table with scribbled numbers and a headline about a lottery winner being scammed by relatives. She leaned in and whispered, "We don't want you to fall victim to anything. If you give us half now, we can invest it wisely." I asked her why she needed half and why she wouldn't trust me to decide how to use my own money. She blinked, her eyes narrowing, and said that she and Steve had sacrificed so much and deserved some security. I told her I had already hired an attorney, and her face reddened as she spat. "You'd rather give it to some lawyer than to your own daughter?" I felt my jaw clench, and I reached for the validation that had eluded me all my life when I whispered, "After everything I gave you, this is how you talk to me." People at the neighboring table pretended not to listen, but I could feel their glances like mosquitoes buzzing in my ear. I told Alice that I was setting up a trust for Thomas and that the rest would go toward my own needs and charities close to my heart. She laughed bitterly and said I was being ridiculous, that Thomas needed the money now, not in 25 years. I reminded her that as Thomas's parent, she and Steve were obligated to provide for him, not me, and that the trust was for his future education and stability. Her nails drummed on the table, and she leaned back, crossing her arms, and said, "If you don't agree to this, you'll regret it because you'll never see him again." My stomach turned, but I kept my voice steady and replied, "I won't be blackmailed. Not by my own flesh and blood." She stood abruptly, knocking her chair, and the room hushed as she stormed out, leaving me and the check for 2 unsipped drinks. As the waitress came over and asked if everything was all right, I lied, saying we just had a small disagreement and that I'd pay the bill. On my way home, I stopped at CVS to pick up a refill of my blood pressure medicine, my head still spinning with Alice's ultimatum. The pharmacist greeted me by name and offered me a free blood pressure check. The numbers were high but not alarming, much like the situation I found myself in. On the way out, I passed a display of Mother's Day cards, and I felt the bittersweet weight of how those cards once made me cry from joy. Days later, a letter arrived bearing a Wells Fargo logo, addressed to me in a neat hand that wasn't mine. Inside was a note from Steve claiming he had opened a new joint account and that he needed my signature to protect the winnings. He included a pre-filled form that would have added his name to my funds, along with a sticky note saying, "Just sign where the X is." My hands shook, but my anger steadied me, and I put the form into a folder labeled Evidence. I called Renee, and she told me that under no circumstances should I sign anything that would make him a joint account holder. She drafted a letter on my behalf, stern but polite, instructing Steve and Alice to cease all attempts to access my funds, and warning that any further harassment would be documented. We sent it certified mail so they would have to sign for it, leaving a paper trail as crisp as the leaves outside turning in late October. That weekend, Steve showed up at my house unannounced, his pickup idling in my driveway as he pounded on the door. I watched from the living room window, my phone ready to dial the sheriff if he tried to force his way in. He shouted that he just wanted to talk, but the way his fist met the wood told me he was there for a fight. I opened the door a crack, my foot planted behind it, and asked him what he wanted. His eyes scanned the living room, taking in the lace curtains and my collection of hummingbird figurines, and he smirked as if they were proof of my smallness. He said that I was tearing the family apart, and that Alice had been crying for days, and that Thomas missed me, but that he couldn't see me until I came to my senses. I repeated the boundary I had set. The money would go into a trust, and I would not hand over half to anyone, not even my daughter. He raised his voice, threatening to sue me for emotional distress and to go to the media to tell them I was greedy and spiteful. I told him to leave, and when he refused, I began recording with my phone held discreetly against my hip, capturing his tirade. After another minute, I reminded him that I would call the sheriff and that in Montgomery County, trespassing could lead to arrest. He laughed as if daring me, so I dialed the non-emergency line, my voice calm as I reported an unwelcome visitor refusing to leave. Within 10 minutes, a cruiser pulled up, lights flashing but siren silent, and the deputy stepped out, his hat shielding his eyes from the midday sun. The deputy listened to both of us, took my statement, and then told Steve that without a lawful purpose, he needed to vacate the property or face charges. Steve cursed under his breath, but ultimately got in his truck and peeled away, his tires spitting gravel onto my lilac bushes. The deputy turned to me and quietly suggested I might consider filing a restraining order if the harassment continued, and I thanked him for his time. I closed the door, locked it, and felt my shoulders sag with exhaustion. Even victory felt like a loss because I never wanted the police involved in my family. That night I sat with Denise over a piece of store-bought cheesecake from Safeway, and we talked about how children sometimes become strangers. She told me about her cousin in Michigan who hadn't spoken to her parents in years because of a similar inheritance dispute. It hurt my heart to hear these stories, but also made me realize that greed was a common disease that thrived in silence. Denise suggested I write Thomas a letter explaining my love and the decisions I was making to give to him when he was old enough to understand. I took out a yellow legal pad and started writing, my hand cramping as I tried to put decades of love into words. I told him about how I used to carry him on my hip while stirring spaghetti sauce, and about how he used to fall asleep with his hand tangled in my hair. I explained that his parents' choices had forced me to make boundaries to protect myself and him, and that sometimes adults make mistakes they regret later. I wrote that this money would be there for him if he wanted to go to college, start a business, or simply have a cushion against hard times. As I wrote, tears dripped onto the paper, making tiny ripples that I hoped would one day remind him that my love was real and messy and never conditional. Weeks passed without contact from Alice or Steve, and I threw myself into volunteering at the local library's reading program, where I helped kids sound out words like courage. I also took up a silver sneakers class at the YMCA to keep my joints limber. The instructor joked that I could now buy the place, and I laughed along without telling him why that joke hurt. During this time, I hired a CPA recommended by Renee, a man named Harold who wore suspenders and smelled like pipe tobacco. Harold walked me through the tax implications of the lottery, explaining that after federal and Ohio taxes, my lump sum would be closer to $7.5 million. He showed me how to stagger charitable donations to minimize tax burdens and how to invest in low-risk municipal bonds. He also recommended paying off my mortgage and setting up an emergency fund separate from the trust because banks freeze accounts upon the death of the account holder. He joked that while my kids were trying to bleed me dry, the IRS was the one that would actually get the biggest slice. When I mentioned that I might be buying a new car, he suggested I go to a reputable dealer like Honda, known for longevity and resale value. I nodded, remembering the commercials with cheerful retirees driving around town, and thought about how independence can come on 4 wheels. One afternoon, I went to the DMV to renew my driver's license, and the woman behind the counter asked if I wanted to register to vote or become an organ donor. I thought about how many times I had given parts of myself away and said yes to both, because giving to strangers felt easier than giving to ungrateful family. While waiting, I overheard a man complaining about his ex-wife taking half of his 401k, and I wondered if fairness was ever universally agreed upon. Around this time, I noticed that my landline caller ID displayed numbers I didn't recognize. When I answered, it was often silence or someone hanging up. I suspected Steve was testing whether I would pick up, so I let my answering machine, a retro model with cassette tapes, take the calls and fill with static. Denise joked that I needed to upgrade to an AT&T fiber line, but I liked the weight of the old handset and the way the cord twisted around my fingers when I was nervous. One Thursday morning, my doorbell rang, and I opened it to find a woman in a tailored suit holding a business card from Child Protective Services. She said there had been an anonymous complaint alleging that I was an alcoholic and that my home was unsafe for Thomas. My eyes widened as she glanced around my living room, her clipboard ready to note any sign of negligence, and I realized how low Steve and Alice were willing to sink. I invited her in, offered her coffee, and calmly showed her every corner of my home, from the neatly folded linens to the bag of toys I kept for Thomas. She smiled sympathetically and said the complaint seemed baseless, but that she had to document the visit, and I felt a flush of shame at being examined like a suspect. When she left, I called Renee, who advised me to document any retaliatory actions, because false CPS reports can constitute harassment and are illegal in Ohio. I began a journal writing dates, times, and details of every instance of contact or intimidation, my handwriting a record of resilience. As the weeks rolled into months, I kept busy but also watched the driveway, half expecting Steve to appear again or Alice to show up in tears. In early spring, as crocuses poked through the soil, I received a certified letter from an attorney representing Alice and Steve. They were threatening to sue for intentional infliction of emotional distress and claimed I had promised them half of the winnings. Renee responded with a counter letter citing the legal principle that promises must be supported by consideration and that I had made no such agreement. She attached the audio recording of Steve threatening me and the copy of his bank form as evidence of their coercion attempts. Renee reminded me that lawsuits like this often get thrown out, but we should be prepared to go to mediation if a judge required it. The thought of sitting at a table across from them and hearing them spin lies made my stomach churn, but I knew I was standing on firm ground. Renee also filed a motion for grandparent visitation to establish a court order allowing me regular time with Thomas since Alice had cut off all contact. In Ohio, courts look at the history of the relationship and the best interests of the child, so I gathered photos, calendars showing my babysitting hours, and notes from teachers attesting to my involvement. We even requested Thomas's school counselor write a letter about his attachment to me, and she agreed, noting that he often mentioned missing his grandma Mabel. As we prepared for the court date, I cleaned my house compulsively, as if dusting the baseboards would somehow dust off the sadness clinging to my heart. The hearing took place in a county courtroom with beige walls and an American flag standing sentinel in the corner. Alice and Steve sat on one side with their attorney, and I sat with Renee on the other, our shoes clicking on the tile echoing in the nearly empty room. The judge, a middle-aged woman with salt and pepper hair, asked questions about our relationship with Thomas and our respective households. Steve's attorney tried to paint me as controlling and greedy, while I spoke calmly about birthday parties, school pickups, and pancake breakfasts. Renee presented the audio recording of Steve's threats, the letter from CPS clearing me, and the evidence of my consistent involvement in Thomas's life. The judge's expression softened when I mentioned that I used to rock Thomas to sleep while humming old lullabies my mother taught me. After an hour of testimony, the judge ruled that I was entitled to visitation every other Saturday and 1 week in the summer, ensuring that Thomas would not be cut off from me. Alice shot me a look of pure venom as we left the courtroom, but I felt lighter knowing that the law had recognized our bond. Back home, I made a pot roast in my slow cooker, the aroma filling the house, and I cried into the gravy as the tension finally broke. The first visitation day felt like Christmas. Thomas ran up the driveway, his backpack bouncing, and he threw himself into my arms. We baked cookies, decorated them with sprinkles, and I told him stories about when his mother was his age, like the time she cut her own bangs and glued glitter to her forehead. He giggled, and for a few hours I forgot about trusts and courtrooms and let myself be just Grandma. As he played with his toy cars on the rug that evening, he looked up and asked, "Grandma, why doesn't Mommy want me to come here?" My throat tightened, and I told him that sometimes adults have disagreements, but that those disagreements are never the child's fault. He nodded solemnly, and then asked if we could have pancakes for dinner, and I laughed and said of course, because pancakes cure most things. In the months that followed, the visits became routine, and the edges of my anger smoothed into a resigned sadness. Alice and Steve complied with the visitation order, perhaps realizing that continued defiance could lead to contempt charges. I noticed that Steve had traded in his old truck for a newer Chevrolet Silverado, and I wondered if he had found a new job or a new source of funds. One afternoon, while Thomas and I built a Lego tower, he casually mentioned that Mommy and Daddy had a new friend who came over a lot. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, but I kept my tone light and asked what the friend's name was. He shrugged and said, "Uncle Brad," and that he had a big watch and smelled like cologne that made his eyes water. I tucked that away, another thread in the tapestry of my family's unraveling, and decided not to mention it to Alice yet. During this time, my own life flourished in unexpected ways. I joined a quilting club and discovered I had a knack for piecing patterns into something beautiful. The women there welcomed me warmly, and we shared stories over steaming cups of Lipton tea and slices of banana bread. At a quilting retreat, I met a retired probation officer named Carol, who told me about her own experience with a greedy son-in-law. We laughed and cried together, and she told me she had found peace by giving to charity in her son's name, a final act of grace he never appreciated. I started making quilts for the neonatal intensive care unit at the local hospital, each stitch a prayer for a child who might not know his grandma. I also discovered a new love of gardening. I bought a few bags of Miracle-Gro at Home Depot and turned my backyard into a riot of zinnias and tomatoes. The act of coaxing life from soil felt healing, and I thought about how seeds need both darkness and light to sprout. I even upgraded my phone to a consumer cellular plan, partly because it was easy to use and partly because the commercials always featured cheerful retirees rediscovering freedom. Alice called less and less, but when she did, it was always with a transactional tone, asking for help with Thomas's tuition or for a car repair. I politely referred her to the trust I had set up, reminding her that she could petition for funds related to Thomas's health or education. Each time she hung up quickly, clearly frustrated that I had installed a gatekeeper between her and the money she wanted. One summer afternoon, I was sitting on my porch watching the cardinal pair that nested in the dogwood, when a thick envelope arrived by certified mail. Inside were divorce papers filed by Alice against Steve, citing irreconcilable differences and financial deception. My first reaction was shock, then guilt, then a strange sense of relief that maybe the partnership that had amplified their greed was dissolving. I learned from Denise, who still heard snippets at the grocery store, that Steve had been having an affair with a co-worker and had drained their joint account. He had apparently used some of the money he thought he'd get from me to buy a motorcycle and take trips without Alice. Alice moved back into the small rental house she had lived in after college, taking Thomas with her, and suddenly she was the one alone on Saturday nights. She called me in tears, telling me that Steve had emptied their savings and that she couldn't make the mortgage payment without his help. I listened, my heart softening despite everything, because she was still my child and heartbreak is heartbreak even when self-inflicted. She asked if she could borrow just enough to cover the mortgage until she could sell the house, promising she'd pay me back. I took a deep breath and told her that while I couldn't just hand over cash, I could help her find a reputable real estate agent. I connected her with a woman from my church who worked with seniors selling their homes and explained the process clearly and kindly. Alice agreed, and within a month, her house was on the market, and she was living in an apartment across town, a downgrade in status she clearly resented. Meanwhile, I continued meeting with Harold, who encouraged me to diversify my investments and consider setting up an annuity with Fidelity to ensure a steady income. He also suggested making annual donations to my local food bank and the library, places that had supported me when Carl was laid off years ago. Writing those checks felt like watering roots that had nourished me, a far cry from the feeling of being extorted by my own daughter. As the year turned, I received a postcard from Alice inviting me to Thomas's school play, and I accepted gratefully, hoping our tentative peace would hold. At the play, Thomas wore a paper crown and recited his lines with the earnestness of a 6-year-old who thinks the world still bends toward good. After the show, Alice hugged me for the first time in months, her shoulders shaking, and whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom." I hugged her back, smelling a new humility in her tears, and told her we could talk when she was ready. Over coffee at my kitchen table, she confessed that she had been jealous and scared, and that Steve had convinced her I wouldn't take care of her and Thomas. She admitted that she had known about my lottery win because Steve had opened my mail without my permission, an act she now recognized as wrong. She also said that Uncle Brad was not an uncle, but a friend of Steve's who had offered them a shady investment opportunity that ended up being a scam. My mind raced with anger and relief, anger at the invasion of privacy and relief that the puzzle pieces now fit into a coherent picture. I told her that unauthorized mail tampering is a federal offense and that she should be careful about the people she aligns herself with. I also told her that healing would take time and that trust, like my mother's old china, is fragile when cracked. We agreed that going forward, any request for Thomas's benefit would be made in writing and reviewed by the trustee, and that she would respect my boundaries. It was not a perfect reconciliation, but it was a start, and I chose to believe that people could change when given the chance and held to healthy standards. As summer deepened, I invited Thomas to help me harvest tomatoes and cucumbers, his small fingers nimble around the vines. He asked if we could make a salad for his mom, and we did, layering the slices like a mosaic and drizzling them with balsamic. When Alice came to pick him up, she smiled at the gesture and said she hadn't tasted such good produce since Grandpa Carl's garden. We laughed softly, the first shared laugh in what felt like years, and I felt the knot in my chest loosen a fraction. Yet I never forgot the lesson this saga had taught me, that boundaries are acts of love for myself and for those I care about. Months later, I sat in the courthouse again, this time finalizing paperwork to turn the trust for Thomas into an education savings plan administered through a 529. The clerk at the county clerk's office asked if I wanted a certified copy, and I said yes, thinking of all the documents I had collected since this began. I filed them neatly in my fireproof safe, next to Carl's watch and my mother's letter, artifacts of a life both ordinary and extraordinary. As I closed the safe, the metal latch clicked with satisfying finality, and I whispered to the empty house, "This is still my house, no matter how loudly anyone shouts." On my 73rd birthday, Denise brought over a quilt her quilting circle had made for me, each square embroidered with a word like strength, grace, and wisdom. We sat by the window, sipping Ensure shakes and watching the leaves turn, reflecting on the year that had passed. She asked if I had any regrets, and I said only that I wished I had learned to say no earlier in life. She nodded, understanding, and said that sometimes our hardest lessons come when we least expect them, but that they pave the way for our finest hours. We watched as a UPS driver delivered a package across the street, and I thought about all the deliveries life brings, each requiring a signature of acceptance or refusal. One crisp morning, I woke early and walked to the cemetery to visit Carl's grave, carrying a thermos of coffee and a folded lawn chair. I sat on the dew-damp grass and told him everything. The lottery, the threats, the court battles, and the quiet healing starting to sprout. As the sun rose, I felt his presence like a hand on my shoulder, and I knew he would have been proud of me for standing up for myself. On my way home, I stopped by a small diner for pancakes and bacon, the server refilling my mug before I asked, and I smiled at the small kindness. At the checkout, I paid with my Chase debit card and thought about how financial institutions had been necessary allies in this journey. I tipped generously, remembering the days when every dollar mattered and vowing never to let wealth harden me. That afternoon, I wrote a check to the Montgomery County Women's Shelter in memory of my own mother, who had always opened her home to women in need. The shelter director wrote back thanking me for the gift and saying it would go toward fixing a leaky roof, and I felt a warmth that money cannot buy. As winter approached, I hosted Thanksgiving for the first time in years, inviting Alice, Thomas, Denise, and a few neighbors who had become like family. We cooked together using my mother's Pyrex dishes and an old crock pot that had survived 3 decades of potlucks. The turkey browned evenly, the sweet potatoes caramelized perfectly, and the cranberry sauce jiggled like a jelly jewel on the plate. At the table, we went around sharing what we were thankful for, and when it was Alice's turn, she looked at me, tears forming, and said she was grateful for second chances. I squeezed her hand under the table, feeling the past, present, and future weave together like the threads in Denise's quilt. Later that evening, after everyone left, I sat by the window with a cup of chamomile tea and watched the first snowflakes drift down like confetti. The house was quiet, but it was not empty. It was filled with the echo of laughter, the scent of gravy, and the knowledge that I had reclaimed my dignity. The story of my daughter threatening to cut me off from my grandson had begun with rage and ended with something softer but stronger, boundaries enforced with love. In this moment, I remembered the video on Grace's stories that had given me courage, and I whispered a thank you to that stranger who had shared her pain. If you've ever been made to choose between your own sanity and someone else's greed, know that you are not alone and that boundaries are a form of grace. As I drifted to sleep, the digital clock on my nightstand blinked 11:11 again, and I made a wish not for wealth but for peace. I hope Thomas grows up understanding that love is not measured in dollars, but in pancakes flipped, quilts sewn, and time spent listening. I hope Alice finds healing and learns that gratitude is a muscle you must exercise, just like we practice our stretches at Silver Sneakers. And I hope that anyone listening to my story hears the whisper beneath the drama. You can reclaim your power without losing your heart. When I think back to my 25-year-old self, balancing Alice on my hip while flipping pancakes on a greasy skillet in our first apartment, I realize how far we've come. Carl used to work double shifts at the plant while I took in mending and babysitting, and we dreamed of a day when we wouldn't have to worry about groceries. We saved pennies in a Folgers coffee can for Alice's school supplies, clipping coupons from the Sunday paper, and praying our old car would start on cold mornings. Sometimes I wonder if those lean years planted the seed of scarcity in Alice, making her see money as love and the lack of it as neglect. Back then, our idea of a big night out was renting a VCR from Blockbuster and ordering pizza from a local mom-and-pop place if we had extra tips. We didn't have much, but we had each other, and the sound of Alice's laughter in that drafty kitchen was worth more than any lottery ticket. There was a time when my biggest worry was whether the landlord would raise the rent and whether the furnace would make it through another Ohio winter. I remember counting down the days until payday, my hands rough from scrubbing floors, and thinking that if I could just get one break, life would be easier. It's funny how a windfall can feel like both a blessing and a curse, opening doors while slamming others shut with its weight. I wish I could go back and warn my younger self that sometimes the people you love most will weaponize your generosity against you. After the lottery win, I found myself looking over my shoulder, wondering if every smile from a neighbor hid a calculation about my bank balance. At Kroger, a cashier whispered to another employee and glanced at me, and I felt my cheeks burn as if my grocery cart were a billboard of my fortune. I debated switching stores and driving to Walmart across town, but then I reminded myself that I hadn't done anything wrong by being lucky. Still, the scrutiny gnawed at me, and I longed for the days when I could buy milk and bread without feeling like a spectacle. Denise joked that I should put on sunglasses like a celebrity, but even with tinted lenses, I could feel the weight of curious eyes following me down the aisles. One afternoon, a reporter from a local news station left a message on my machine, asking for an interview about senior lottery winners and family dynamics. I let the tape run out rather than call him back, because I knew my story was not fodder for a soundbite, but a cautionary tale wrapped in love and pain. At church, the pastor's sermon on forgiveness made me squirm in the pew, my fingers tracing the grooves in the hymnal as he talked about letting go of resentment. He said that forgiveness is not for the other person but for ourselves, a way to unclench fists that are tired from holding on to hurt. I wondered if forgiving meant forgetting, and I knew I could not forget the feeling of my daughter's voice using Thomas as a bargaining chip. Yet as I sang the closing hymn, my voice trembling, I felt a sliver of peace sneak in, reminding me that anger is heavy to carry for too long. On another day, I visited my friend Mary Ann at the rehab center where she was recovering from hip surgery, and she told me her own children had fought over her house before she was even discharged. Her eyes were watery from pain meds, but the hurt in her voice was clear when she said, "They're counting the days until I'm gone." We held hands, two older women bound by stories of ingratitude, and promised each other we'd keep telling our truths so others would feel less alone. Around this time, I received a call from my estranged sister in Florida, who had heard about the lottery through a cousin's Facebook post. She laughed nervously and asked if I remembered the pact we made at 16 to share everything, including secret crushes and candy bars. I told her that childhood promises don't extend to adult windfalls, and she sighed, saying she'd always felt I owed her after she loaned me $40 in 1984. It struck me how money can revive old resentments like ghosts rising from dusty attics, banging on walls we thought were sealed tight. We reminisced about summers spent running through sprinklers and winters spent sledding down the hill by the elementary school, and for a moment, the years melted away. Then she casually mentioned her son's upcoming wedding and how expensive destination ceremonies were, and I understood why she had called. I wished her well, reminded her that my resources were tied up in trusts and plans, and hung up feeling both sad and resolved. In the middle of all this, I had a health scare. Sharp chest pain sent me to the emergency room at Miami Valley Hospital on a gray Tuesday. As I lay on the gurney under fluorescent lights, wires stuck to my chest, I realized that my emergency contact list still had Alice's name at the top. I stared at the ceiling tiles, patterned with tiny holes, and thought about who would pick up if the nurse called. Would Alice answer or let it ring out of spite? Thankfully, it was only severe indigestion, too much chili at the church potluck, but the incident made me rethink who was actually there for me. I updated my forms, adding Denise as my primary contact and Harold as secondary, and felt a mix of freedom and grief at that small administrative change. After my release, I treated myself to a latte at Starbucks, something I rarely did, savoring the foam like a small rebellion against frugality. The barista wrote Mabel on the cup, missing the E, and I laugh because even when life is complicated, small misspellings can ground you in humanity. Sitting by the window, I watched young parents wrangle toddlers, teenagers scroll on their phones, and businessmen in suits tap on laptops, all absorbed in their own lives. It hit me that everyone has a private drama, a silent wound, or a secret joy that isn't visible to the casual observer. Later, at home, I pulled out the notes from Renee about wills and estate planning and decided to attend a free workshop at the Senior Center on Probate Avoidance. The presenter from Edward Jones spoke about beneficiaries, payable on death accounts, and the importance of updating designations after major life changes. I jotted down questions on the back of an old grocery list, like whether my living trust would supersede any will, and how often I should revisit my plan. During a break, I chatted with a woman named Barbara, who confided that her son had cleared out her savings under the guise of consolidating accounts. Her story echoed mine so closely that it made my skin prickle, and we exchanged phone numbers, promising to check in on each other. We joked about forming a club for mothers of greedy children, but underneath the humor was a shared resolve to protect ourselves. The next day, I noticed my neighbor Peter struggling to fix his lawnmower and offered to help, remembering how Carl used to tinker with engines on Saturday mornings. Peter is in his 40s, a widower raising 2 kids, and he told me he had seen Steve leaving a bar on Main Street with a woman who wasn't Alice. It stung to hear confirmation of Steve's unfaithfulness, but it also cemented my resolve that I was dealing with people whose loyalties were as flimsy as wet tissue. Peter said his own mother had warned him never to mess with a woman's money or her knitting, and we laughed at the truth wrapped in that joke. These small interactions, neighbors with gossip, friends with advice, strangers with empathy, wove a net beneath me that kept me from falling deeper into despair. As summer turned to fall, I hosted a small gathering for my quilting group, serving sweet tea and deviled eggs on my grandmother's china. We spread our latest projects across the living room, each stitch a testament to time spent, and I marveled at how healing can be as simple as thread and conversation. Carol, the retired probation officer, told us about a case she once had where a man forged his mother's signature to take her house, and how he ended up in jail. The story sent a shiver through me, and I silently thanked the universe for laws that, while imperfect, can sometimes deliver justice. One afternoon, I drove to the county fairgrounds for the annual farm show, something Carl and I had done every year before he passed. The smell of kettle corn and sawdust filled the air as children squealed on rides and farmers showed off prize pigs, and I felt a nostalgic ache. I wandered through the craft exhibits and saw a blue ribbon on a quilt that looked remarkably like the one I had donated, and my heart swelled with pride. At a booth selling homemade jams, I chatted with a woman from Indiana who mentioned she watched videos on Grace's stories and felt less alone afterward. We talked about how hearing someone else's survival story makes your own burden feel lighter, and she encouraged me to keep sharing mine, even anonymously. Back at home, I started journaling more diligently, filling pages with memories of Carl and of Alice's childhood, not for anyone else, but to keep my history straight. I wrote about the smell of Carl's aftershave, the click of his belt buckle, the way his laugh filled a room and made even bad days seem bearable. I wrote about the time Alice ran away at 15 after we grounded her for sneaking out, and how we searched for her in a panic only to find her at the library. I wrote about the morning she told us she was pregnant with Thomas, her hand shaking as she held the test, and how I held her and promised we'd figure it out. These memories were like threads I could weave into a tapestry that reminded me of who I was outside of this conflict, a woman with a long life lived. During one of my Silver Sneakers classes, a fellow participant named Janet mentioned she had switched her homeowner's insurance to GEICO and saved a bundle. We laughed at how our conversations had shifted from grandbabies and recipes to interest rates and insurance premiums, a sign of our evolving priorities. Janet also told me about a support group at the community center for grandparents raising grandchildren, and though my situation was different, I decided to attend. The facilitator, a social worker with a soothing voice, encouraged us to share our stories and to brainstorm ways to maintain relationships with grandchildren without enabling adult children's bad behavior. Listening to others talk about negotiating boundaries, court hearings, and late-night calls from desperate kids, I felt a camaraderie that eased my loneliness. One woman named Sharon described how her son had pawned her wedding ring, and we cried together, our tears validating each other's grief and resolve. Another man, Robert, proudly reported that he had taught his grandson to change a tire, a simple act that gave him a sense of purpose after a season of chaos. These stories reminded me that healing isn't linear, and that revenge doesn't always mean striking back. Sometimes it's about reclaiming yourself through everyday acts of love. I also took up painting at Michael's, buying a beginner's acrylic set and a canvas, and discovering that blending colors soothed my racing thoughts. My first painting was of a sunrise over a farmhouse, rough but earnest, and when I showed it to Thomas, he told me it looked better than real life. His compliment made me feel like a kid again, scribbling with crayons, unburdened by adult complexities and betrayals. Around Halloween, I carved a pumpkin with Thomas, scraping out the seeds and roasting them with cinnamon and sugar, a tradition that grounded us in the present. We dressed up as matching scarecrows for the community parade, and neighbors smiled and waved, some knowing my story and nodding in quiet solidarity. The parade route passed by a Walgreens pharmacy, and I remembered picking up my first prescription there when I turned 60, a milestone that felt both mundane and monumental. In line, a young mother complimented my costume and asked if I was Thomas's grandmother. When I said yes, she told me she never had one, and that Thomas was lucky. Her words warmed me and reminded me that roles like grandmother are privileges, not rights to be bought or sold. As winter approached, I received holiday cards from people I had never met, viewers of Grace's stories who had found my mailing address through mutual friends. One card from a woman in Texas said that my courage had inspired her to confront her own sons about a secret loan they expected her to forgive. Another from a man in Oregon said he had started therapy after realizing he was repeating his father's mistakes with his daughter. These messages were like lanterns glowing along a dark path, illuminating the impact of sharing even painful parts of our lives. In early December, I was invited to speak on a local AM radio show about financial literacy for seniors, sharing my experiences with trusts and boundaries. The station smelled like old carpet and coffee, and the host, a man with a booming voice, asked me gentle but probing questions about how I had navigated greed and guilt. I told listeners that banks have policies to protect customers and that they should never feel bad for asking multiple questions about their own money. I reminded them that adding someone to an account gives that person legal access to withdraw funds, and that guardianships and power of attorney should be carefully considered. The phone lines lit up with callers, many of them women, thanking me for my honesty and sharing their own short stories of betrayal and resilience. After the show, I was tired but energized, and I treated myself to lunch at Panera Bread, where I sat alone among families and enjoyed a bowl of broccoli cheddar soup. I overheard a woman telling her friend about a sale at Kohl's, and I smiled, realizing that life goes on with its simple pleasures amid our private battles. Back at home, I hung twinkling lights around my window, the glow reflecting in my hummingbird figurines, making them look like they were fluttering again. Alice called me later that week, her voice softer than I'd heard in a long time, and asked if we could go Christmas shopping together for Thomas. We met at Target, walking through aisles of toys and winter coats, and for a moment it felt like those lean years when we scoured clearance racks together. She picked up a Lego set Thomas had been eyeing, and I suggested we split the cost, not because she needed help, but to practice cooperating as equals. At the checkout, the cashier wished us a Merry Christmas, and Alice squeezed my arm, a silent gesture that spoke volumes. That night, as I wrapped gifts with shiny paper and ribbon, I thought about how generational love can be mended piece by piece, like tape smoothing down paper edges. Still, I knew better than to let my guard down completely. Trust rebuilds slowly, like muscles after surgery, and overexertion can cause a setback. I attended a holiday concert at Thomas's school, and as he sang off-key with the other children, my heart swelled with pride and a fierce protectiveness. In the row ahead of me, a woman whispered to her husband about a family member asking for money, and I whispered a prayer for her strength. After the show, Steve approached us, looking thinner and more tired than I remembered, his voice low as he wished me a happy holiday. I nodded politely, feeling no hatred, just a quiet resolve to keep our lives separate unless he truly changed and made amends. He handed Thomas a small gift and told him he loved him, and for Thomas's sake I allowed the exchange, though my guard remained firmly in place. On New Year's Eve, Denise and I stayed in, watching old movies and sipping ginger ale out of wine glasses, laughing about how wild we used to be. At midnight, we clinked glasses and vowed that in the coming year, we would continue to choose ourselves and encourage each other to set firm boundaries. I thought about how the words no and enough can be revolutionary when directed at those who think they own your time, body, or bank account. I also resolved to travel more, using some of my winnings to see the Grand Canyon, a place Carl had always wanted to visit but never did. I booked a trip through AAA, planning to drive in the spring with Denise and take in the red rocks and endless sky, because life shouldn't be postponed forever. When I told Alice about my trip, she asked if she and Thomas could join for part of it, and I set the boundary that this trip was for me, but that we could plan another together. She understood, and instead we planned a weekend camping trip to Hocking Hills, complete with a rented cabin through Airbnb and plenty of s'mores. On a rainy February night, I received a call from Barbara, the woman from the estate planning workshop, who told me her son had served her with eviction papers. I offered her empathy and the number of Renee's firm, knowing firsthand how crucial competent legal help can be when family lines are redrawn by greed. I hung up feeling grateful I had found allies and angry that so many mothers were treated like obstacles instead of anchors. Thomas's 7th birthday rolled around, and we threw a small party at my house with a homemade cake and a piñata from Party City filled with candy. We invited a few of his classmates, and I watched as he ran around the yard with sticky hands and pure joy, a reminder of why I fought so hard for visitation. Alice and I collaborated on the party, each of us taking turns slicing cake and refilling juice cups, a choreography we hadn't performed in years. After the party, she thanked me and said she admired how I had handled everything, acknowledging that Steve's influence had clouded her judgment. Her words were like balm on a burn, soothing but still tender, and I responded that I hoped we could continue rebuilding trust for Thomas's sake and ours. In the quiet after everyone left, I sat on the porch with a piece of leftover cake and let myself feel proud of how far we had come since that day of the ultimatum. I thought about revenge, not as a fiery act, but as a steady reclaiming of my life, my dignity, and my right to peace. Revenge for me had been using the systems intended to protect us, banks, courts, trusts, to ensure my generosity wasn't exploited. It had been learning the difference between helping and enabling, between love and obligation, and between forgiveness and forgetting. It had been choosing to walk away from manipulative demands and toward relationships built on mutual respect, even if those relationships were new or unexpected. There were still moments of sadness, especially when I looked at old photos of Alice and me laughing at a picnic table or blowing out birthday candles together. But sadness no longer anchored me. It moved through me like weather, and I learned to grab a sweater or open a window depending on the forecast. The smell of Steve's cologne no longer made me flinch. Instead, it reminded me of a chapter closed and a lesson learned. The ticking of my kitchen clock now felt like a metronome marking the rhythm of a life reclaimed, rather than a countdown to confrontation. Sometimes late at night, I'd scroll through the comments on Grace's stories, adding my own words of encouragement under a pseudonym to strangers who felt trapped. I'd type messages like, "You are not alone, protect your peace, and the law is there for you," hoping to offer the lifeline I once reached for. I also found myself more patient with small annoyances, like long lines at the post office or a slow driver in front of me, because I had faced bigger battles and survived. When a neighbor's dog dug up my marigolds, I laughed instead of fuming, realizing that not all uprooting is malicious. Sometimes it's just an animal following instinct. I donated my old car to Habitat for Humanity, happy that my faithful Taurus would help build a home for someone else starting their next chapter. The dealership gave me a small credit toward a new Toyota Camry, and I chose a model with heated seats, a luxury I justified after decades of drafty cars. Driving off the lot, I felt both giddy and a little guilty, but Denise reminded me that comfort is not a sin and that I had earned my peace. As the spring trip to the Grand Canyon approached, I packed a small suitcase and a camera, ready to witness a landscape carved over millennia by persistence. Standing at the rim, I felt tiny and powerful all at once, like one small woman with a story that had carved her own canyon through hurt and healing. I sent a postcard to Thomas telling him about the colors and the vastness, encouraging him to dream bigger than the demands that had once bound us. I also sent Alice a postcard with a simple note, "Wish you were here someday," leaving the invitation open and the decision in her hands. While traveling, I stopped at a Chevron station off Route 66 and bought a souvenir mug, another small marker of a life that now included time for joy. The attendant chatted about gas prices and weather, blissfully unaware of my saga, and I enjoyed the anonymity of being just another traveler. On the way back, Denise and I detoured through Nashville and caught a live country music show at the Grand Ole Opry, a dream we had shared since our 30s. We sang along to songs about heartbreak and resilience, our hands clapping, our voices blending with strangers, united by melody and shared human experience. Upon returning home, I planted a new row of peonies, their buds tight with promise, a symbol of how sometimes beauty takes time to unfold. I invited Alice and Thomas over to see them, and as we knelt in the dirt together, our hands dirty and laughter light, I felt the weight of the past lighten. That afternoon, the mail brought a check from State Farm refunding me an overpayment on my policy, a small but welcome surprise, and I marveled at how far I'd come from counting pennies in a coffee can. Later, I went online and registered for an AARP seminar on cybersecurity because I knew that the next threat could come via email rather than a knock at the door. Protecting myself had become second nature, but it was no longer rooted in fear. It was an act of self-respect and love for those who truly cared about me. One evening, I hosted a movie night for my quilting group, streaming a classic on my Roku and serving popcorn in bowls my mother used to use for mashed potatoes. We laughed and cried and stayed up past our usual bedtimes, savoring the company and the knowledge that support systems can be built at any age. As the credits rolled, Carol whispered that she admired how I had turned my pain into purpose, and her words landed like a gentle hand on my shoulder. I thanked her, thinking again about how revenge can be quiet and still powerful, like stitching two pieces of fabric together with invisible thread. Years from now, when Thomas is an adult and perhaps facing his own tough choices, I hope he reads my letters and understands why I did what I did. I hope he sees that his grandmother didn't let fear, guilt, or greed dictate her life, and that he inherits not just money, but a model of self-respect. I hope Alice sees that boundaries can be a bridge if you walk them carefully, that they teach us where we end and others begin. I hope Steve finds a way to untangle his own knot of entitlement and deceit, perhaps in therapy or through hard-earned consequences. And I hope Denise and the women at my quilting table continue to swap stories, laughter, and tears, building a fabric of solidarity that can't be torn by greedy hands. As for me, I'll keep flipping pancakes, sewing quilts, and watching hummingbirds until my hands can't anymore, living proof that quiet power is still power. What would you have done if your child demanded your winnings and threatened to deny you your grandchild? Share your thoughts and tell me where you're listening from. On a stormy April night, I found an old cassette in a junk drawer labeled Carl and Mabel, 1987, and I played it, listening to our younger voices full of hope. Hearing Carl joke about burnt toast made me laugh and cry, the tape hissing like the sound of rain against my windows, reminding me of simpler worries. I rewound the tape and pressed record, leaving a message for Thomas about staying true to himself, my voice overlapping with the past in a bittersweet duet. Another day, while sorting through Carl's tools, I came across the set of Craftsman wrenches he cherished and decided to donate them to a high school shop class. The instructor called to thank me, and I told him how tools are meant to build things, not be used as weapons in family feuds over money. During a phone call with a childhood friend, she mentioned she had switched her internet to Xfinity because of better customer service, and I realized how small choices reflect self-respect. I made a note to review my own service providers because caring for myself included everything from financial boundaries to reliable Wi-Fi for Netflix nights. At a farmer's market, I overheard two teenagers discussing whether to spend money on sneakers or save for college, and their earnest debate warmed my heart with hope for their future priorities. I bought a bouquet of sunflowers from a vendor and placed them on my table, their bright faces reminding me that beauty often grows from seeds planted with intention. I visited a local art museum on a free admission day sponsored by Target, wandering through rooms of paintings and sculptures that stretched my imagination and soothed my soul. Standing in front of a huge landscape painting, I felt small but connected, thinking about how every artist had a story behind the canvas, unseen by most viewers. On the museum bench, I jotted a note to myself to keep seeing new things, because stagnation is another form of surrender to those who wish us small. I joined an online forum for grandparents and was surprised at how many posts were about adult children manipulating them. The sense of community was immediate and empowering. One poster recommended a book about setting boundaries that I ordered from Amazon, and the tips inside reinforced many of the steps I had already taken instinctively. In a moment of levity, I took a beginner's yoga class at the community center, nearly toppling over during tree pose, but laughing with the instructor about finding balance at any age. The instructor told us about her grandmother, who had taught her to say no without apology, and I tucked that wisdom into my pocket like a smooth stone. I invested in a cordless vacuum from Dyson because my old upright was heavy, and as I zipped around my living room, I realized convenience can be a kindness to yourself. While cooking dinner one evening, the smell of garlic and onions reminded me of Sundays at Olive Garden with Carl, when we splurged on pasta and endless salad once a year. I shared this memory with Thomas, who wrinkled his nose at the thought of unlimited salad, but smiled when I promised to take him when he was older. As I flipped through channels one night, I landed on a documentary about financial scams, and I watched intently, grateful for the knowledge I had gained through my ordeal. The program mentioned that most fraudsters are people close to the victim, and I felt a pang, but also validation that my caution was warranted. One afternoon while sewing, I pricked my finger and thought about fairy tales where small injuries foreshadowed big awakenings, and I smiled at the metaphor. Another friend told me she had invested in a small mutual fund through Charles Schwab and encouraged me to diversify further, a reminder that growth can still happen in our 70s. I scheduled a meeting with a representative from Schwab at the local branch and asked questions I never thought I'd ask, like how to balance risk and reward at my age. He answered patiently, and I felt a sense of mastery over concepts that once felt as foreign as Greek, realizing learning is another form of revenge against those who think you're gullible. Around this time, a niece I hadn't heard from in years sent me a message asking how to start saving for her kids' college, and I directed her to resources rather than writing a check. It felt good to share knowledge instead of money, empowering others to fish rather than feeding them fish from my net. In mid-July, a neighbor's house caught fire, and as our community rushed to help with blankets, water, and calls to the Red Cross, I was reminded that true wealth is communal care. I dropped off a bag of clothes at the shelter and wrote a check to the family, happy to give where it was needed and not demanded. That night, smelling smoke in the air, I whispered a prayer of gratitude for my own safe home and vowed once again to protect it from metaphorical flames. Denise and I signed up for a weekend woodworking workshop at Ace Hardware, learning to build a small bench and laughing at our crooked cuts and proud of our calloused hands. The instructor, a patient retiree, showed us how to sand out imperfections, and I thought about how life's rough edges can be smoothed with time and attention. In line at Chick-fil-A after the workshop, a teenager took our order and asked if we were carpenters. We laughed and said we were just two women learning new tricks. He smiled and told us his grandmother had recently taught him how to make her famous cornbread, and we saw a little bit of ourselves in his eyes. I decided to organize my legal documents with color-coded folders from Staples, labeling them clearly so that when the time comes, everything will be easy for Thomas to navigate. As I placed the folders in my safe, I felt both sad and peaceful, preparing for a future I would not see, but wanting to leave clarity instead of chaos. One evening, I watched a sunset from my backyard, the sky streaked with pink and orange, and I thought about how endings can be beautiful rather than terrifying. I remembered my mother telling me that every day the sun sets on some worry, and we get to decide whether to carry it into the next morning. I also remembered a comment on Grace's stories from someone in South Carolina who said she listened from her porch, and I smiled at the thought of strangers connected by storytelling. During a snowstorm, I lost power for several hours and lit candles around the house, the flickering light casting dancing shadows that made me feel less alone. I wrapped myself in the quilt Denise had made and read a paperback novel by flashlight, appreciating the quiet and the pause in buzzing electronics. When the power returned, I reset the digital clocks and thought about how resilience is like a battery backup that kicks in when life goes dark. On a whim, I subscribed to the local newspaper again, wanting to support journalism after the reporter's call I had ignored and to stay informed about my community. I enjoyed reading human interest stories about high school band competitions and small business openings, reminders that life is more than conflict. During a routine dental checkup at Aspen Dental, The hygienist noticed my stress-related jaw tightness and recommended relaxation techniques like deep breathing and occasional massages. I scheduled my first ever massage at a nearby spa, feeling indulgent and nervous, but the therapist eased my worries and the tension I had carried for months. As she worked out knots in my shoulders, she said many of her clients were women carrying invisible burdens, and I felt both seen and comforted. In the waiting room afterward, I saw a magazine article about grandparents raising grandchildren and tore out the resource list to share with my support group. I laughed at myself for being that person who takes pages from magazines, but I knew those numbers could be lifelines for someone else. At a garage sale, I found a vintage Pyrex dish identical to one my mother used, and I bought it for $1, feeling like I had recovered a piece of history. I used it to bake peach cobbler, the smell filling my kitchen and transporting me to childhood summers spent barefoot in my grandmother's backyard. Thomas devoured 2 servings, smacking his lips and declaring it better than any store-bought dessert, a compliment that warmed me more than compliments about my financial savvy. On a lazy Sunday, I watched football with Peter and his kids, cheering on the Cincinnati Bengals and shouting at the television like a lifelong fan, even though I barely know the rules. The camaraderie of shared yelling, snacks, and the smell of popcorn made me feel like part of a tribe, reinforcing that revenge doesn't isolate when you let community in. At halftime, Peter and I discussed installing a Ring doorbell camera, and he offered to help me set it up so I could monitor visitors without peeking through curtains. We installed it the following week, and I felt both modern and empowered seeing a live feed on my phone, a small piece of tech shielding my sanctuary. As the year progressed, I returned to the question I asked myself in those darkest moments. What is the price of peace and who pays for it? I realized the price is setting boundaries that sometimes feel like walls, but are really gates, and that those who truly love you will find the gate and knock respectfully. Looking back, I wouldn't change my decision to protect my winnings and my heart, because the cost of surrender would have been my dignity and perhaps my relationship with Thomas. What would you have done if your child demanded your winnings and threatened to deny you your grandchild? Share your thoughts and tell me where you're listening from.